Now, I'm going to introduce a speaker who I think is highly valuable to this summit and someone you may have heard speak in the not too distant past. It's David Wood. He is a pioneer of the smartphone industry and is now a futurist commentative speaker and writer. His latest book, working title, Approaching Rejuvenation, is scheduled for publication during H1 2016, which has already been out. So he has written more books than that. I wanted to say that he has been writing books since 2016. Here we're at 2020. I think David writes a book once every 6 months, if not once a year. So let's remember David as a voice of wisdom because his website is Delta Wisdom. He's also the co-founder of Symbian, the creator of the world's first successful smartphone operating system. And that's a milestone. Thank you, David, for that. And importantly and notably, David is the founder and runs the London Futurist Group, which puts on incredible events frequently. So thank you, David. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Natasha. It's a real pleasure to be here. As you heard, my name's David Wood. I mentioned my social media there, DW2 on Twitter, because I've just posted a copy of my slides there in case anybody wants to get a hold of them afterwards, also on Facebook. My topic is practical steps to improve how the public conceive the future. Ways in which we can improve the public's understanding of the future and therefore improve the future itself. This is a very beautiful landscape, but let me move to a different, bleaker, more barren landscape to illustrate an ancient point of wisdom. Where there is no vision, the people perish. That's from the Old Testament book of Proverbs. There's a modern version of that, which I heard in a fascinating panel yesterday in day one of the H+ Summit, when Anders Sandberg, the senior research fellow from the Future of Humanity Institute at Oxford, said, the problem is when people lose hope, they start turning nasty, which is a modern translation, if you like, of that same sentiment. In more details, what people do today, what we put our minds to, it's strongly influenced by what we believe is possible in the future. If we think that the future is broadly the same as today, perhaps a bit worse, perhaps a bit better, we're not inclined to do great heroic tasks, to get involved in important, huge projects. But futurists are trying to help people to see not just business as usual, but the elephants in the future, whether it's the elephants who could cause a lot of danger, the catastrophic risks that lie ahead, like pandemics, but like other even worse risks that we should be paying more attention to, but we're not. And there's also in this set of possible future, a different sort of huge change, the transcendental opportunities of it's often this opposite side of the same coin, if you like, something that could help us reach much higher levels of existence and experience. So people will be motivated to do greater and important tasks if they can see more clearly the future, provided they also believe they can do something practical about it. Which brings me on to the three great tasks of futurism or foresight. What the world needs a lot more. We need to help people see the full set of future scenarios more clearly, including the rather unpleasant or disturbing elephants that lie out there in that scenario space. Secondly, we need to help people assess these scenarios more thoughtfully, overcoming their initial future shock, overcoming initial feelings of yuck or wow, to see things more objectively in terms of what they might mean for the future of humanity. And then most importantly, third, futurists are aiming to uncover constructive options for people to act here and now to increase the chance of finding and taking advantage of these powerful transcendental opportunities and also decrease the chance of these catastrophic risks. Why we need these skills more than ever is because there are more waves of rapid change ahead for 4 reasons. First, the world is connected more deeply with faster connections than ever before in all kinds of ways, which means we are more vulnerable to all sorts of contagions. We're vulnerable to biological contagions, but also to contagions in the financial instability systems. We're vulnerable to contagions of fake news, conspiracy theories, and yes, we're vulnerable to what we might call good contagions as well. Second, we are living in a time of potentially exponentially accelerating technology. As Jose Cordero spoke about, NBIC, nanotech, biotech, infotech, cognitech, which means not just that we're more connected than ever before, but what we share is more powerful, potentially more destructive, potentially more constructive. Third, there are growing imbalances with the environment. In some ways, we are using the environment more thoughtfully and less destructively than before, but in other ways, the balance with the environment is getting out of control into very dangerous situations. And last, there are growing imbalances within society as a whole. More inequality, more perceived inequality, more feelings of tribalism and partisanship. To summarize, we have greater strength and greater intelligence, but sometimes we lack the greater wisdom that goes with it. And for all these reasons, I think it's fairly plain that there will be many disruptions ahead. We need to be better at seeing them in advance and managing them. But we're not very good as a society at seeing disruptions in advance. We didn't foresee the pandemic very well. I'll say more about that shortly. Here's another example from a few years back. Some of you might recognize the lady in the front of this picture. She is the Queen of England, who was visiting a new building in London School of Economics in 2009, which was being opened, and the professors were showing her all their clever technology and graphs for managing the outcome of the financial chaos, the crunch of 2008. And the Queen, in her magisterial way, asked them, "Hey, you guys, why did none of you predict this credit crunch?" Probably in more queenly language than that. And after a while, the assembled professors and academics wrote back to the Queen with careful considerations. First, there was a feel-good factor, which had masked how out of kilter the world economy had become beneath the surface. There was a psychology of denial that gripped the world. And yes, there were people who were pointing out flaws, but nobody wanted to listen. And it was much more psychologically convenient to ignore their warnings. And there was an overtrust in people who seemed to be financial wizards, who claimed that all the fundamental problems of macroeconomics had now been solved. There would never again be a crunch. And they had lots of clever theories, apparently, that prove why it was. There was problems of logic, but more, there was problems of psychology and problems of our social relationships. So let me try and draw this together with a more systematic summary of why our foresight historically has been poor and how to improve it. I'll take this stage by stage. There's too much of linear thinking in our mental makeup. We tend to assume that the future will be the same as the past, or the future will extend the past. And that was true for most of history, but it's no longer true. We need to teach people much more about exponential thinking, that the future will actually transcend the past, acquiring whole new dimensions of possibilities. We have to teach people how exponential transformation takes place, that often it's very slow to start off with. It seems to be irrelevant. And then there can be an accumulation which causes transition from a slow, disappointing local experience to something that's increasingly global and increasingly fast moving. A transition that can often be catalyzed by external shocks or by convergence. And a lot of Foresight is about pointing out not just individual trends, but possible convergences that complicate things, bringing new risks and, yes, new opportunities. So the first thing we need to do is to provide in people's education, children's education and grown-ups education, lots of examples of how these exponential changes build up and happen. We have to explain more about positive feedback cycles. But yes, we've also got to go beyond what I would call naive exponential inevitabilism. You know, an exponential isn't just a single curve. When you look at it more closely, this is something that Intel's CEO and founding figure Andy Groves wrote about a lot. A single apparent exponential is made up of a sequence of individual S-curves. When it starts off slow, then there's a fast and furious, but then it runs out of speed and you need to make another step to another model or another paradigm. And there's nothing inevitable about any of that. And that's what we need to teach people. We need to teach people to be aware of things that can slow down possible exponential curves, as well as things that can accelerate them. And we have to teach them about the human and political influences on progress. And I'll say more about that shortly. So too much linear thinking, not enough exponential thinking. Too much absolutist thinking. This is another characteristic of the human mindset, which is no longer suitable in today's complicated world. And absolutist thinking says, yes, this will happen at this time. Things will happen in the year of 2045 or 2035. And the problem with this is it leads people to think a forecaster is either right or wrong. And if they hear one forecast that seems to be wrong, then they lose interest. And so there were forecasts in the past of pandemics. People will forecast that MERS might go global and be chaotic, that bird flu might go global and be terrible, that SARS might go global and be terrible. And they said, we've had enough of these people crying wolf, we don't need to pay attention. Instead, we need to teach the world to understand the complicated, nuanced thing called probabilities. We have to talk about forecasts and say, well, there are possibilities, but the actual outcome depends on human reactions and on numerous butterfly effects, by which I mean a small change can lead on in an escalation to something much larger. A butterfly flaps its wings on one side of the world, and on the other side of the world, a tornado arises. So the point of making forecasts is not to be right or wrong. It is to stretch people's thinking and to prepare them for a wider set of scenarios. So we shouldn't say, yes, this will happen for sure. We should say, this might happen. Let's consider what might be involved. So what we need to do, we need to educate children and grown-ups alike of examples of forecasts that successfully changed history, either by being self-unfulfilling forecasts, when people said, if we're not careful, this terrible thing will happen, and society adapted, or forecasts that became self-fulfilling, despite multiple unknowns being involved. So here's an example, a forecast that did change history dramatically. You person here, John F. Kennedy, giving his famous speech in September 1962, we choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade to do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard, because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills, and so on. Well, here's a forecast that might change history in the same way. We choose sustainable superabundance for all within one generation by 2035. And just as Kennedy and his team did not know exactly how they would go to the moon and back, they had some basic ideas. We don't exactly know how we'll achieve this, but we can see the possibilities. It's in these same nanotech, biotech, infotech, cognotech revolutions that we've spoken about. And we can be a bit more precise. We can talk about an abundance of clean energy by accelerating green technology, an abundance of healthy food by accelerating synthetic biotech, an abundance of material goods and shelter, affordable health, all-round intelligence, creativity, external and internal space, plenty for everybody, enabled by an abundance of collaboration and democracy via a different set of technologies, social tech. That is a forecast that can, I think, change history when we explain it in more details. And here's another forecast that can change history. And like the last one, it's not certain. Like the last one, it's only a probability. And this forecast is that a new dark age lies ahead, a humanitarian tragedy, an environmental disaster. Instead of an abundance, I'll talk about a preponderance. Too much polluting energy because we don't develop green tech fast enough. Too much malnutrition because we fail to get GMOs and other synthetic biology approved and used. Too much waste and biohazard because we are too slow in developing better nanotech. Too much chronic disease because we are too slow at developing rejuvenation biotech. Too much unwise cleverness. Too much back-breaking toil. Too much overcrowding because we don't develop these other technologies. And too much inequality, tribalism, bitterness, and strife because we fail to develop that social technology. What's this social technology, you may be asking? Where does it fit in this NBIC picture that I sketched out earlier? Nanotech, manipulating material at the atomic level, biotech, manipulating, amongst other things, our genes, infotech, making sense out of big data bits and machine learning, cognitech, understanding and improving our neurons. Well, social tech must be at the heart of all that we do. Social tech is about understanding and emphasizing the right values. And unless we do that, then there is the risk of the bad future outcome from these more powerful technologies. Let's dig in one more level. Let's look inside the kimono. We don't have time to explore this in any depth, but sometimes when I'm talking in my professional business, I talk about 25 ways the world will be changed by NBIC in the next 15 to 20 years. Lots of changes in nanotech, biotech, infotech, and cognitech, and by crossover combinations, sometimes called planetary tech. These are all possibilities. But again, I say the most important thing is the social technologies. And now I'll spell that out. Finance, clouds, ledgers, blockchains, markets, regulations, they all involve technologies. But if we're not careful, they will not serve humanity well. They will serve subsets of humanity. They will lead to more divisions. And the two most important, I have bolded: the technology for better education, better delivery of education, but also better content, and technology for better collaboration, politics. So to start drawing my remarks to a close, just keep an eye on the time. One other thing which has caused us to be bad at foresight is what I'll call not just what goes on inside individual heads, it's the systemic things about the way society is set up. And society encourages, in some ways, too much short-term thinking. By focusing in businesses on quarterly reports to keep the shareholders happy, to keep the financial metrics apparently pointing in the right direction, and politicians are always motivated that in the next electoral cycles they've got good news to report. It's too much short-term stuff. It's there for a reason. In evolutionary times, it was appropriate to think in short term, but now we need to champion the longer term at all levels of society. So we should have government ministers at the cabinet level responsible for the future. And all businesses and all other organizations should have champions for the future. And instead of just focusing on the financial metrics, we need the metrics of human flourishing, not just today, but sustainably in the future. Related to this, another aspect of our setup that makes us behave irresponsibly, it's a more complicated thing. I'll call this too much self-centered thinking. And it's because that the work to properly understand and anticipate catastrophic risks, as well as transformational opportunities, they're a public good. And public goods are problematic because what it means is that the benefits of such research apply to everybody. And individuals are loath to bear the cost. So most companies will say, let's not do fundamental research. Let's just focus on taking advantage of what's here today. And so there's a problem sometimes called the tragedy of the commons. People don't want to put a lot of effort into something that they won't be able themselves to directly benefit from more than others. Well, economists, politicians have long known the answer to this. It is that we need to find ways to ensure that society does address these public goods, perhaps by politics. And this is one thing that politics can sometimes do well, ensuring that there is research into these areas. But today it's more complicated again, because individual governments aren't sufficient. Nowadays, the big risks and the big opportunities are international in scale. And many individual countries are tempted not to get involved. We see the United States of America walking away from the WHO. And in many other ways, people are saying they shouldn't hurry up to develop the climate change solutions because that other country over there is not pulling its weight. Well, we need to do better. We need inspired bridge building to encourage people from different competing countries, nevertheless, to cooperate in identifying and dealing with these catastrophic risks and, yes, the transcendental opportunities. And here's an example. Some of you who are young enough may recognize these two figures. On the left, Mikhail Gorbachev, who, when he came to power in the Soviet Union, inherited a state that had for 68 years declared the Western world as their fundamental enemy. And on the right, Ronald Reagan, who, when he came to power in America in 1981, declared the Soviet Union an evil empire. And both of them were hell-bent on improving the offensive capabilities and defensive capabilities of their own systems. Ronald Reagan was doing something that was officially called the Strategic Defense Initiative, colloquially called Star Wars. What changed? In part, it was the work of a futurist. Let me Photoshop him into this picture. Some of you may recognize Carl Sagan. And the reason I put him there, although he wasn't actually in the meetings, is that he was involved in understanding and communicating clearly, openly, vividly about bigger catastrophic risks than these guys had previously expected. He said, if you set off your nuclear weapons, as you seem to be planning to do, it won't just fry and burn up and fire large cities, it will potentially destroy the whole world via nuclear winter, something that had not been understood before. And this caused the warmongers in both the Soviet Union and the United States to slow down. So we need more people like Carl Sagan with the ability to communicate openly, vividly, and credibly. And so I'll wind up by summarizing what skills futurists hope to encourage everybody to pick up. I want everybody in the world to think of themselves as a futurist, a practitioner of foresight. We need as many such people as possible. To see the set of future scenarios more clearly, we need to help people understand trends, to understand the possibilities of science and technology, and also understand the possibilities of transforming human nature, what can be changed and what can't be changed. We have to help people understand and explore convergence, and this often requires imagination. It requires artists freed from the bounds of convention to dare to think things beyond our instinct. But then we have to assess these scenarios carefully. We can imaginatively think them up, but then we have to assess them. Are they really credible from a science and technology viewpoint, and are they really credible from a human and social viewpoint? And beyond the credibility question, even more important is the desirability question. Once we set aside our future shock and our wishful thinking, which of these scenarios really do deserve being promoted and accelerated, and which should we say, no, 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 that is not as good as you think? And sometimes what can change a bad scenario into a truly good one is the willingness and the decision to give something up. Maybe there are some things we can give up, which will actually lead us all into a much better future. And again, that requires imagination. And lastly, we need to monitor what's happening all the time, rather than just make a decision and stick with it. And then for the actions, we need to take the experience of agile experimentation, ideally safely, ideally in emulated worlds or in realistic fiction. We can explore possibilities and figure out what may work. We need a big roadmap, but we need interim goals along the way, because unless there are realistic interim goals, people are not going to engage. And yes, we need to be able to celebrate the small wins. And you may be thinking, my goodness, that's a lot of skills we need. Well, I will say there are lots of us, provided we can collaborate. And how can we collaborate? In part, if we're all understanding and bought into the same vision. So that's why I underline as the last and possibly most important skill is communications. So in summary, there are all these skills which are practical, we need to enhance and develop. And if we can do that, we will help the world to see more clearly the dangers, but also the wonderful possibilities in our midst. And we will encourage people to set aside their parochial concerns, their distractions. They'll be willing to pool together and achieve a much, much better future. Thank you very much.
And thank you, David. Wonderful presentation full of very rich content and very interesting ideas worth exploring more in depth. I do have some questions for you that came from your presentation. So first of all, I would like to ask you what are the current barriers to superabundance, and what are we failing to align incentives around?
So, for example, I think we are not doing enough to incentivize people to develop next generation green technology. There was a fascinating talk yesterday, for those who were listening, from Alishba, talking about the possibilities to have better energy storage and so on. But in each case, there were issues and drawbacks to the technologies. So I think that society as a whole needs to set financial incentives to encourage people to stop developing polluting technologies, carbon-based technologies. So this is the idea of a carbon tax. We've had taxes and incentives before. There was the example of the ozone layer going back a few years, when it was discovered that things in fridges and things in aerosols were accumulating in the upper atmosphere, causing a hole in the ozone layer, which would lead to increased cancer, increased radiation. And the politicians of the time, in part led by the British Prime Minister, who had been a chemist in her youth, Margaret Thatcher, set more financial incentives and legislation to encourage big corporations who at first hated the idea, but then they came around to the idea and they developed their innovations more quickly. So I think we need to accelerate putting a carbon tax in place. I think we need not just the stick, we also need carrots. I think we need to recognize the possibilities of the true nanotechnology. That's the molecular scale factories that Eric Drexler wrote about. We've had other kinds of nanotechnology, but not that true vision. And we should have society investing more fundamentally in that, rather than what happened in practice, which is that lots of other companies got involved and said, hey, we're doing nanotechnology, we'll take this funding, thank you very much. And it was for something less fundamental. So these are some of the things. We need to change how society decides to invest. And of course, we will make some mistakes. But in the past, some countries have done very well with some industrial strategies. I look at the remarkable transformation in South Korea. The government decided various things, and some of them were poor, but lots of them were very successful. Look at the industrial strategy of Singapore, and even America in the past had its industrial strategy with the creation of the internet and DARPA, which led to many things happening. So we need more of that.
Yeah. I think you answered perfectly my question, and you got the point very correctly. It does seem to me that sometimes people scared of the future because they prefer the doomsday scenario somehow. There is a sort of negative narrative that people like to embrace more than the positive one. And I want to give you an example from my own personal experience dealing with Sophia in the last few years. I've been doing public relations for Singularity Net and working with Sophia. So the very first time Sophia went viral was when she said that she wanted to destroy humanity, right? And despite all the effort that David Hanson made to frame Sophia as a loving robot, as a loving AI, as a positive figure, then when she said that, people were going sort of like, oh, I knew it. I knew she actually wanted to destroy humanity. So why do you think people have such a negative perception of the future, and why they want to believe this doomsday scenario?
So there are 2 points here. One is we have to be careful what we say, because sometimes if we say the wrong things, it may get magnified very quickly. People have lost their brand value with a single careless remark, which people were allowed to take out of context. So we do need to be more skilled generally in what we say. But no, you're right. The other angle in this is that people have been immersed in dystopian pictures of the future. And even though they will say, of course, I don't really believe that Terminator stuff, but if that's all they've seen, it influences how they think. There's a famous statement from, I think, Swift from 1700s, one of the old writers, who said, the lie goes racing around the world before the truth puts its boots on. And even when people find out that it was a lie, still it has done its damage because people don't realize what have actually influenced their thinking. So we needed to put lots of positive stories around of positive change. Now, in the past, we did live in a time of optimism. The Victorian era in Britain, the progressive era in parts of the United States, when there was many visible signs of progress. But people are seeing less of that now. And people are therefore more inclined to believe the dystopia. So we have to be better at carving out better pictures of the future. That's why I think we had the question yesterday. Perhaps it was for David Brin, the question, or maybe Michael Masucci, I can't remember which, but the question was, what films or books do you like as good representations of the future? And the answer was, actually, there aren't many possibilities. So we need to fix that urgently. We're not going to make a completely thrilling dramas, but we want people to understand, hey, this is a great future, how it could be. And then people will be less inclined to follow that part of their nervous disposition. They'll be more inclined to listen to the part of them saying, actually, humanity can do better.